I want to welcome everyone this evening, and glad it's snowy evening. We're doing this by Zoom rather than having had to go someplace. My name is Pat Szynski. I am the current chair for the Door County League of Women Voters. And again, want to welcome you all here tonight. This is an interesting new idea that has been bubbling to the surface of a possible different way of doing primary elections. And so in order to tell us about it, we invited Sarah Eskridge from Democracy Found to describe how this works and answer our questions about this new way of voting. Sarah is the executive director of Democracy Found, a Wisconsin-based nonpartisan initiative committed to revitalizing our democracy, which is something we desperately need. She also serves as a senior advisor to the Institute for Political Innovation, which all sounds very exciting. So without further ado, I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that she is a graduate of the University of Wisconsin, Madison, holds a master's in public affairs from Robert La Follette School and the Master's of Public Health from the University of Wisconsin School of Medicine and Public Health. So now, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah, who will tell us about Final Five voting.
Great. Thank you, Pat. I'm really pleased to be with you all this evening because I was lucky enough to have a great conversation in Sturgeon Bay with Sandy and Pat just a few months ago about this very topic of Final Five voting. And it's always a pleasure to get to share this innovative new idea with more people. I think it's important to start with the fact that today, I think even more than most days, it feels particularly important and powerful to talk about something as critical as democracy, right? We are in this place where there's literally war being waged over, in many ways, democracy versus autocracy in our world right now. So making sure that we, in this great American experiment of doing representative democracy, continue to improve on our great American experiment is a real pressing matter and incumbent on all of us to remember the responsibility of citizens to improve our democracy over time. It's not something that's static. We have a very small constitution that delegates a lot of powers to innovate over time to make our system work better. And that's the power of a democratic republic. So with that, I think I'll start by saying that for me, I came to this work a few years ago. Our initiative is Wisconsin-based, it's Wisconsin grown, and it started with an idea from a Wisconsin business leader, Katherine Gehl, who wrote a book that really was a light bulb moment for me, having been someone who had previously worked in policy work for a long time, but also in politics, and saw this frustrating intersection in my day-to-day life all the time between the fact that we could have the greatest policy in the world, we could have a very common sense, pragmatic solution to one of our country's biggest problems, and politics would just get in the way of us making any progress on that common sense improvement to one of our nation's biggest problems. So reading her analysis, which you can see here is now written up in a book, Harvard Business Review Press, published in 2020. It's long, it's a really thorough analysis that I'm certainly not going to give you all the details of today, but I think it's suffice to say that what the light bulb moment was for me and for so many other Wisconsinites that I've talked to, and maybe it will be illuminating for you all today, is this analogy between politics being an industry, essentially being a protected duopoly that has these super high barriers to entry and making it so that customers, us voters in this industry, have virtually no power. So you can think about it in another way, which is to say, in any other industry as big and as thriving as politics that has regularly 90% customer dissatisfaction, right? We regularly are dissatisfied with Congress's performance, and only two competitors, there would be some new entrepreneur who would see this as a great business opportunity to enter the market, meet that customer dissatisfaction demand, and respond to what customers need and want. But that doesn't happen in politics, because it turns out that our political system is a uniquely anti-competitive industry with really unhealthy competition. So no matter how many times we say it, Washington isn't actually broken. It's doing exactly what it's designed to do. So we all know that in any human endeavor, whatever the rules are of that game are going to affect the way the game is played and the outcomes of that game. So the fact that these rules of the game in politics, rules that frankly most people don't think about or have never heard of, are actually at the core of our political problems that we see today. And unfortunately, what that means is that we are never going to see some sort of change candidate who's going to save us, because it's a systems problem. It's a design problem. So let's start with that design flaw that's very well summed up. Our current problem with our current system is in this slide, which is to say, this is supposed to be a Venn diagram. But in this particular Venn diagram, there's virtually no intersection, right? There's no connection between Congress acting in the public interest and the likelihood of members of Congress getting reelected. And there's one key design problem that's particularly detrimental and creates this non-intersecting Venn diagram. And it's something that most people don't think about, but I expect that you all, League of Women Voters, think about it more than most, which is to say the party primary. Because frankly, party primaries are the only elections that really matter for most federal, most US House and Senate races. In over 80% of our US House races, the elections are decided in the primary, right? Months and months before we even go in on the November ballot, we already know who's going to win. In a safe red district, whoever wins the Republican primary is virtually guaranteed to win the general election. And in a safe blue district, whoever wins the Democratic primary is virtually guaranteed to win that general election. And so what that means is that the vast majority of general elections have virtually zero impact in our congressional races. So when people say that they're so frustrated because they feel like their vote doesn't count, all too often, that's reality, right? That's the case. That's the design problem that our system creates, because effectively, only 10% of voters turn out for these determinative party primaries. So it's effectively 10% of the population that has all the power and all the say, right? They are in control. And that 10% of voters is distinguished by one really critical characteristic. Even though you might think that the 10% on the right and the 10% on the left couldn't be more different, right? Those voters in the Democratic Party primary or the Republican primary, but they do have this one thing in common, which is that they hate each other, right? They hate the other party more than any particular ideology or any particular policy. It's a real thing. It's called negative partisanship, right? Political scientists have studied this for a long time. And what it means is that these 10% of the voters who more than anything care about hating the other side are the ones who are in control of what can or cannot get done in Congress. So think about it. In any organization that you're a part of, if you wanted to solve your biggest problems, I expect that one thing that you probably wouldn't do is get everybody, together in the room and say, hey, you guys, so hold on, before we get to work, let's count off 1, 2, 1, 2, and divide into 2 warring teams, and then we'll get straight to work. But that's what happens almost every day in Washington, D.C. So let's play it out even further, right? Which is to say, imagine that you are a member of Congress. You're going to represent Door County in the US Congress. And you're deciding how you want to vote on some really important bipartisan bill that has a comprehensive solution to one of our nation's biggest challenges. I worked in healthcare for the past decade before I worked on this stuff. So my issue is going to be around healthcare reform. You pick whatever issue it is that matters to you: immigration, the budget, national security, infrastructure. You might think that you would ask yourself as a member of Congress, some common sense questions when looking at that bipartisan solution to this problem, which is to say, is this a good idea, right? Is this a policy that is going to make a difference? Is this the right solution for us to pursue? Or even, is this what the majority of my constituents would want me to vote for? I'm an elected representative. Do my constituents want me to vote for this piece of legislation? But you don't ask yourself those questions right now in Congress as a member, because there's only one question that you can really afford to consider. And that question is the question of, will I make it back through my next party primary if I vote for this bill? And if the answer to that question is no, which it virtually always is on these consensus solutions, on the complicated stuff, because consensus solutions don't win party primaries, right? So it doesn't matter what you really think on that policy issue, because the rational incentive to get reelected dictates that you vote no. And if you decide to vote yes on this bipartisan solution anyway, you're going to be threatened with, or actually get a primary from your right or from your left. Because as you all know better than anyone, primary is not just a noun anymore, right? It is a verb, and it is a very active verb, as in we are going to primary you. We're going to take you out in your low turnout party primary and create this driving force of dysfunction in Washington, D.C., because it forbids the two sides, or even particular Democrats or Republicans, to come together and deal powerfully with these complex trade-offs that are inherent to solving any of our nation's biggest challenges. Our party primaries basically forbid these two sides from negotiating consensus solutions, because those actions, those compromises, those trade-offs don't win these party primaries. Gridlock, grandstanding, demonizing the other side is what wins party primaries. So let's go back to this design flaw Venn diagram, right? And we can put it more simply, which is to say, if America's elected representatives do their job the way we need them to do their job, they're likely to lose their job. And that's a crazy design. So what do we do about it, right? This is particularly depressing, but what's exciting is that this problem is not particularly inherent to candidates, or even to parties, or the nature of our two-party system itself, or even to people who have ideologically strong or perceived extreme views. Often innovation comes from the fringes. That's where new ideas can come from. And that's not our problem. Our problem is that there's outsized power in that 10% negative partisanship that says you can't compromise on anything to move the ball forward. So fortunately, we can fix both of these kind of problems, this problem of the party primary and the unhealthy competition that makes it so that there's no intersection in this Venn diagram. So the design solution that we're working on at Democracy Found and that we propose, and Catherine Gale really came up with in her original thesis and work, is called Final Five voting. And it solves for these design flaws of our system by changing incentives that will drive behavior in Washington, D.C. So critically, unlike typical kind of some other reforms, this is not a Trojan horse for one side or the other, and it's not even necessarily designed to change who wins elections. It's designed to change what the winners have the freedom to do and are incentivized to do once they are elected, and on whose behalf they're doing it. So essentially what Final Five voting does is it makes the general election the most important election, as it should be, and ensures that our elected representatives are accountable to that broad general electorate in their district. So the way that we do that is we make two changes to our electoral system. The first is to get rid of the party primary. So here's how that works. Essentially, you get one ballot, and instead of having to pick or choose if you're going to vote in the Republican column or the Democratic column, you see all your candidates for a particular race in one column on that primary ballot. It'll include third parties, independent candidates, everybody. And you vote for your favorite. So in this particular race, let's see, I'm going to vote for the Green Bay Packers. They will be my favorite in the primary. And the top 5 finishers, not just 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, advance to the general election. So now we benefit because the election is not already decided. We have 5 candidates and have this dynamic, diverse competition of ideas, visions, candidacies, credentials, all these things between the primary and the general election that allows us to have a real accountability-driven election in the general election. So in that general election, we have to figure out who should win. And it's not as straightforward as we might think, because in a healthy, competitive 5-way general election, we can't leave our current system of plurality voting in place where if someone gets the most votes, they win. So to say someone could win with 21% of the vote in a 5-way race in our current system. And that's crazy. That means the vast majority of people preferred someone else. So we get rid of that problem of plurality voting by using a tool called a ranked choice ballot to implement instant runoff general elections. So what that looks like is I get a ballot, looks like this. I see my 5 candidates and I can pick my favorite just like always, and I can turn in my ballot just like that. So I can say I like the Packers in the primary, I like them in the general election, I'm done. But I can also, if I choose, say that if I can't have the Packers, I also like the Bucks. The Brewers are pretty good. I don't really like the forward, and I definitely don't like the Admirals. So I can rank as many or as few candidates as I choose, as I want. And what that allows us to do, whoops, getting ahead of myself here, is it allows us to indicate our full preference in an election, in a general election. And when the polls close, you count all the first place votes. And if someone gets a majority, if someone gets over 50%, then the election is over and that candidate wins. But if the leader falls short of 50%, an instant runoff is automatically triggered, which means that last place candidate, whoever came in last, had the fewest votes, is automatically eliminated. They're out of the race. And anyone who voted for that candidate has the opportunity to have their single vote automatically transfer to their second choice. And that process of elimination and automatic transfer of that single vote happens until one candidate goes over that 50% threshold of support. And what that allows us to do is it's exactly like we were having a series of actual runoffs, but we've capped all our votes at once and the tabulation goes through that runoff process automatically for us. And it allows us to make sure that whoever wins in the general election has the broadest appeal to the most voters. So, right, let's kind of quickly summarize the solution. The solution, final 5 voting, is 2 things: the change to the party primary to have a top 5 primary, and then an instant runoff general election. Those 2 things together make up what we call final 5 voting here in Wisconsin. And again, remember, what's interesting about final 5 voting is that it's not necessarily designed to change who wins. A Republican is probably still going to win in a red district. A Democrat is probably going to still win in a blue district. But all of a sudden, we have competition happening in the general election. The general election is the one that matters. And you might have different options in a blue district of Democrats, different options of various Republicans in a red district. And that choice, that accountability of the general electorate for that elected official makes a really different incentive happen when governing. So if you go back to that example where we are all members of Congress and we're looking at that bipartisan, consensus-oriented solution to one of our nation's biggest problems, imagine, right? You couldn't vote yes on that in our current electoral system, even if you thought it was the greatest solution ever, because you'd be threatened with a primary and then you'd be taken out and you wouldn't continue your job. But under Final 5, it's a different story, because you could be the same person, you could be looking at the same legislation and have different incentives and get a different outcome. Now you can vote yes if that's what you want to do and what the majority of your constituents would want you to do. Because right now, you only answer to the party primary voters. But under this new system, you don't just answer to party primary voters, you answer to the general electorate. And you know that you can make it through a top 5 primary if you're an incumbent and you're doing your job well and you're representing your constituents well. And then all of a sudden in that general election, you can get a combination, a coalition of support from people who maybe give you their first, second, maybe even some people give you their third choice vote, and put together that winning coalition. So what that does is it really changes this calculus in the Venn diagram to create the possibility of some overlap here, right? Because all of a sudden there's some ability, there's an incentive to actually solve some problems. It frees up our legislators from the tyranny of these party primaries because they now have the political freedom to innovate, to lead, to think independently, to reach across the aisle when it's helpful, to negotiate and make deals and deal powerfully in trade-offs instead of just sitting there in gridlock, grandstanding. They can deliver solutions. And if they don't deliver solutions, now we have a system that's guaranteed that they'll get some new and healthy competition in the next election. So one of those 5 candidates in a general election could mount a legitimate challenge to put pressure on them to deliver solutions, basically holding them accountable the way accountability and competition creates results in any other marketplace. So maybe that sounds pretty good to you all. It sounds pretty good to me. Get pretty excited about it. But it also sounds kind of maybe pie in the sky. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's really lovely, Sarah, but how on earth are we going to get this done? And one of the powerful things about this is it's not just powerful in theory. It's actually achievable. We can get it done in a series of years and not decades. So proof is in the pudding, right? Which is to say, back in 2017, the original work on this was published by Katherine Gehl, our co-founder of Democracy Found here in Wisconsin, with her co-author Michael Porter in a Harvard Business School report. And somehow that report made its way up to Alaska, where someone named Scott Kendall read the report and decided to take some action. He designed a ballot initiative, including these new rules of the game of politics. And in November of 2020, that initiative passed. So Alaska has become the first state in the nation to choose this healthy competition in politics. And they certainly aren't going to be the last. Because Article 1 of our Constitution, I alluded to this earlier, it gives states the power to change rules of the election at the state level. So we get to choose differently. We get to decide here in Wisconsin how federal elections are run. It happens through state legislation. So what that's looked like for us here in Wisconsin is that back in 2018, my board chairs, Katherine Gehl and Austin Ramirez, came together to form this effort and create a really powerful cross-partisan group of leaders from across the state who have come together to grow support for Final Five voting. So it's still in the nascent stage, it's a new thing, but there is bipartisan state legislation that was introduced in early 2021. Support was fast. We got support from the Wisconsin State Journal editorial board, the La Crosse Tribune editorial board, and just this past December, the Senate Elections Committee held a hearing on the legislation. So certainly the momentum is starting to build around this idea of doing things differently. I have to tell you that I really think that I have the privilege of discussing Final Five voting with leaders, both elected and non-elected leaders in our state every day. And it's both amazing to me, but not super surprising to see how much it resonates no matter who I'm talking to. Because it is something that is systemic. It's not something that's going to inherently benefit one side or the other. And it all of a sudden, that fact in and of itself opens up a different conversation around election reform than so many other things that we've been talking about here in Wisconsin. So if it resonates for you, like it resonates for me, I encourage you to stay in touch with us at Democracy Found. Please follow up with me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all tonight, and I look forward to our dialogue because that's always the most fruitful part. But I will say that really my ask of you all tonight is one of education and outreach, because Final Five voting is probably something you've never heard of. And so many other people are in the same situation. So our biggest challenge and opportunity right now is to get ahead of that learning curve, to get out there to talk about Final Five voting and to talk about it in cross-partisan settings, right? You can talk about politics again in the places that you don't think you can talk about politics. the number of Rotary clubs and other presentations that I've done on this topic of Final Five voting has been pretty significant, because it is something that we can talk about in our traditionally apolitical civic circles, because it is so systemic and not something that is a Trojan horse for one side or another. So with that, let me pause, stop. I can stop sharing my screen here so we can look at each other. And I would love to answer any questions you might have. Oh, and I actually see some questions in the chat. Should I start? I'll start with Elaine's questions in the chat. Okay.
I want to ask
Fabulous.
a question about,
It's right here, more
okay,
chat.
chat.
I'll start in the chat, and then if I don't answer it, we'll go to you, Tim. So the question is, what if one of the 5 candidates gets 90% of the votes in the first round? So let me go through, because it's kind of easiest if I just walk through an example of how we tabulate ballots. I should have known that the League of Women Voters members would want all the details about how you tabulate this. Some people don't, but you all of course do. So let's walk through the example. So these are election results that we did in an in-person event that we did in spring of 2019 in Wisconsin. So same sports teams, same kind of top 5 primary, right? Makes it to the general election. I fill out my ballot, and here's the question around tabulation. So in first choice votes, right? We're just counting first place votes here. You see that no one had over 50% support. It was a particularly competitive election. The Bucks were in the playoffs at the time, so they did surprisingly well in this particular election. So you have to go through this. This means, right, that automatic triggering of the instant runoff process happens. So if you look at those first place votes displayed just slightly differently so that we can go through the tabulation here, you see that the forward came in last. So the forward eliminated from the race. They are no longer in this race, and anyone who voted for the forward has the opportunity to have their single vote transferred to their next choice. So in this particular race, you see that most of them went to the Brewers. They all went to the Brewers in this particular example. So still though, no one has over 50%. So you drop the Admirals. Click here, there we go, click. Drop the Admirals, and their votes kind of split amongst the remaining 3 candidates. You see their second choices went to the Bucks, the Brewers, and the Packers. So we have to go through another elimination, and that single vote transfers. And after that point, then the Packers go over 50% and they win. So again, this shows that maybe those voters didn't get their first choice vote, but their vote wasn't wasted. Because I didn't really get into this from a theoretical perspective, maybe enough in this presentation today, which is to say, so often in our current electoral system, independent and third-party candidates are either a ploy, because, right, they are basically a trick to try to help the other side win by spoiling the election for one side or the other, or they're just wasted votes. And so we're told constantly, like, don't vote for that person, or don't even get in the race, right? Don't even offer yourself as an alternative, because you will be a wasted vote. Now, all of those wasted votes are no longer wasted, because someone can say that they have, you know, their preference is the Libertarian or the Green Party candidate, but if they can't have that person, then their second choice automatically counts and their vote isn't wasted. So it's a particularly powerful solution to this problem of plurality voting that inherently limits us to a 2-party kind of competition in our general elections under our current system. All right, I'm just gonna keep trying to grab some of these questions. I'm looking at the questions here. So question, in red or blue areas, wouldn't the bigger name partisan candidate typically get 50%? Entirely possible. Yeah. So, I mean, in this particular system, someone could win with over 50% support right away. And that demonstrates that they have broadest support amongst the general electorate. I think the biggest problem that this solves, and let me be very clear about this, is that it at least makes it so that that person has 50% of general electorate support. Because right now, you don't have to have that much support to win. You just have to have majority support of the low turnout party primary. And if you can make it through that low turnout party primary, then you're virtually guaranteed to win, even if you would never have won in the general election. So we have these very small constituencies with outsized amounts of power in our current system. So, so this is a good question. Why would candidates want to run in a nonpartisan primary? So I talk to candidates and elected officials about this particular topic all the time. One key distinction is that, yes, we are talking about a top 5 primary, but we're not talking about a traditional nonpartisan primary, meaning party affiliation is not on the ballot. In a top 5 system, party affiliation is on the ballot. So I could run as Sarah Eskridge, Democrat, Sarah Eskridge, Republican. I can still self-identify as a party label candidate, just like our party label candidates get to today. From a political science perspective, if you talk to political scientists, they will tell you that those partisan labels are actually very powerful indicators for voters. So if you take away those partisan cues and those affiliations, it takes away important voters signaling, voter information, and makes it harder for voters. So we think it's really important that you keep those partisan affiliations on the ballot. It just means that in a particular area where, again, in a very blue district or a very red district, in a general election, you might have choice between multiple Democrats or multiple Republicans on your general election ballot and can rank them accordingly. And if you're the out party in that particular area, all of a sudden your vote in a general election starts to matter, because you're not just throwing away your vote for the candidate who has no chance of winning. Maybe you're going to vote for that candidate first, but your second choice might go to a flavor of the other party candidate that's closer to your views on issues that you care about. And all of a sudden your vote starts to matter a little bit more, which is pretty important. Going to the questions again. Elaine, I'm wondering if I answered your question by walking through the runoff scenario, which is to say, what if the second group to be eliminated, the question was, what if the second group to be eliminated cast its second best vote for a candidate who is already eliminated? So basically what happens is it becomes a race of who's still in the race. And so if your vote has to transfer and your candidate's already out of the race, then your next choice comes into play. Question from Pat about Alaska. So what do the voters think in Alaska? So they have not used it yet in Alaska. The first time they will use it is in 2022. So they voted for it in 2020. And they're in the midst of an education and outreach awareness building campaign, because the first time they'll use it is in 2022. So what I will say though about Alaska is that we're learning that even having this electoral system changes incentives already for elected officials. So to say, you're probably, if you all are political people in any way, as I assume you are, if you're League of Women Voters members, you've probably heard that Lisa Murkowski is up for re-election in Alaska. Lisa Murkowski is a pretty interesting Republican. She won her last race as a write-in, right? So she was taken out in her party primary, and for one of the very few times in American history, she ran as a write-in and won in the general election. That was a wild scenario. And this time, it's a totally different calculus for her, because she's already running for the general election, right? She doesn't have to worry about that party primary anymore. She will make it into the top. They're doing top 4 in Alaska. We're proposing top 5 in Wisconsin, but nevertheless, right? She'll make it into the top 4 and be on that general election ballot, as will the Trump endorsed candidate, right? And all of a sudden, this inter-party faction fighting that is happening within our party primaries and getting decided in very low turnout elections in states like Wisconsin is going to be resolved in Alaska by the general electorate. So it frees up an elected official like Lisa Murkowski to make sure that when she's governing, she's considering what's going to get her reelected based on the entirety of the general electorate in Alaska, not just what's going to get her through her party primary to get to the possibility of being reelected. So it's pretty powerful from an election incentive standpoint. And I think that's the biggest difference, to get to your question, Sandy, the difference between Final Five and ranked choice voting. The biggest difference is the change to the party primary. So you can use ranked choice voting, you can use a ranked choice ballot as a tool in all sorts of elections. So you might have heard recently the city of New York used ranked choice voting in their mayoral race. They used it within their party primaries. So effectively, general election voters still didn't have a say. We knew who was going to be the mayor of New York after their primary election in June. We didn't have to wait until, I don't remember if it was November or August, but one of those municipal election delays. We didn't have to wait. We already knew that Eric Adams had won because he won the Democratic Party primary. Yes, he won it through a ranked choice system, but nevertheless, independents and Republican voters in New York City had virtually no say in who got elected. So they didn't change from an incentive standpoint where the power lies in their electoral system just simply by using ranked choice voting. So it's not fair to call them the same thing, because Final Five really does focus on, you have to get to a top five primary. You have to open up competition in the general election so that it's the general electorate who's making the decisions, not just the primary electorate. And that's really the biggest distinction in the two electoral systems, even though Final Five uses a ranked choice ballot to make sure that the broadly acceptable candidate wins the general election. What else? Yeah, Stella. Oh, you're muted.
Okay. I can unmute one thing, but my husband has to unmute the other. Anyhow, at the outset, you said that a lot of times we say that Washington is broken, and you said that it isn't. It's working exactly the way it's designed to work. And in the case of Wisconsin here, will this Final Five system of voting, will it have to be passed by the people who are now in power and entrenched in power and very committed to this system that's working wonderfully for them?
It's a great question. Yeah, so in Wisconsin, unlike in Alaska, we do not have binding ballot initiatives, right? So when Alaska passed this, it was because the voters petitioned for a binding ballot initiative to pass it. They passed it for both federal and state elections in Alaska. So they'll use it for all of their partisan elections. The bill that's in the current Wisconsin state legislature is specifically for federal elections. So our ask of the Wisconsin state legislature is to change the rules for Congress, not to start by changing their own election rules. So that's both a strategic policy decision and a decision to focus on where the problem is the worst, which is to say, focus on Washington, D.C., because we can all agree that Washington, D.C. is broken. But to your point, or fixed, however you want to look at it, right? Washington, D.C. is particularly dysfunctional. But depending on where you're at, you may or may not agree that Madison is dysfunctional. And if you are a current elected official in Madison, you might not feel that it is dysfunctional. So starting with Congress and getting familiar with this change, and I believe truly that getting the voters to like this change will create the push and the incentive to change it for potentially more elections, but we're focused primarily on federal elections for that particular reason of getting our legislature to pass these rules for federal elections.
And what are the prospects of that looking like?
Great question. So I mentioned it was introduced this session for the first time. Bipartisan co-authorship and co-sponsorship, which is a pretty significant thing in Wisconsin these days, to have a piece of election-related legislation that is truly bipartisan. So I'm particularly proud of that. And we got a hearing. So also something that's not an insignificant thing to do in the legislature these days. It wasn't just a bill that got introduced that no one did anything about. It got a hearing in the Senate Elections Committee. There were 72 people who testified in favor, 0 testified against. So that was a really good also test to see if there was any opposition that was going to show up. It did not materialize. Now, you all might be familiar with the fact that the legislature is basically wrapping up for the session right now. Today is expected to be the last day of the assembly is in session for this particular legislative session. So I think it's nearly impossible at this point to think that the final 5 voting bill is going to pass this session. But we made great progress in the first session that it was introduced, and we'll look forward to reintroducing in 2023 when they come back after this next electoral cycle. Yeah, Dan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding this right, for up here in Congress, if there's in the primary, each party side has 2 people running. In essence, all 4 of those will end up on the final in the general election.
Could be, or could be, right? It could be an independent or a third party candidate or
Right.
3 Republicans or 3 Democrats. Yeah.
But in essence, if there are 4 people running, all 4 will then again
Correct.
run in the general election.
Yes, exactly. Yep, good clarification. There's another clarification that I just want to make based on Diane's question in the chat, which is to say, what happens when you do that tabulation? Do voters have to come back to the polls for those series of runoffs? No, that's the value of this. It's an instant runoff. It's a very important distinction. So, right, we've seen that in other states where you do have to come back for runoff elections, you see serious precipitous declines in turnout. And therefore representativeness. So the value of this is just a very pragmatic one, which is to say all the votes were cast at once, and it's just a tabulation process, but also one that allows voters to only have to come to the polls once for that general election and go through the instant tabulation. The other thing that I should say is that because ranked choice voting has been around for centuries in other countries and decades here in the United States and used in various municipalities all across the country. So I think it's over a dozen states now use ranked choice ballots in some number of their local elections. So already using them in nonpartisan local elections, the ballot tabulation machines can tabulate a ranked choice ballot. So anywhere that does have kind of the Scantron machines that you fill out your paper ballot and stick it in the machine, anywhere that has relatively new machines has the capability, potentially with just a software upgrade, to process a ranked choice ballot because it has become, mainstream to be used in various contexts. So there is an implementation lift for sure, but it is not an insurmountable implementation lift. Yeah, Pat and Elaine, go ahead.
The more I think about this, the question is then, would we move to a place where why would you even have a primary? You just have the runoff right then, and why go through a primary and then a general? Just have a vote.
Thank you for asking that question, because that's also an important distinction between Final 5 and just using ranked choice voting like they have in various municipal nonpartisan elections, just with however many candidates, and then you can rank your numbers. What we've learned from those instances, there's this concept that gets called ballot exhaustion, which is to say if you provide voters with too many choices, it can be overwhelming and they don't fill out their ballots as fully. So going through a basically narrowing process in the primary election to get to a number of candidates that we can rationally hold in our brains as 5 and then rank them accordingly has particularly powerful ramifications in terms of, at least theoretically, right? We haven't actually tried this yet, but the theory is that will be very powerful in terms of giving voters both real options, but also giving candidates a platform, right? If you make it through a primary election and you're one of 5 candidates in a general election, you get a degree of earned media, of attention, of participation in debates that if we didn't limit that and it was just huge numbers, you might have candidates that would get very little to no attention, just like we frankly do in our current system. So allowing for 5 potentially viable candidates to be the limit is both on that kind of efficient frontier of how many we can hold in our head in terms of choices, but also not artificially limiting the competition in a general election so that voters don't have real choice, because that's also really important from this theory of accountability and the fact that choice competition creates that accountability. Elaine.
Yeah, I was told once that one of the disadvantages of the ranked choice voting or the final 5 is that if a voter does not vote for all 5 of the candidates, their ballot is disqualified. And it was disenfranchising a lot of voters. Is that true?
Yeah, thank you for asking that question, because it's not true. So you can vote for 1, you can vote for 2, you could vote for 3. You don't have to fill out your ballot in its entirety for it to count. So there's actually, theoretically, we've done some interesting studies where oftentimes one of the, as you said, one of the things people say who don't like this whole idea of using a ranked choice ballot is that you have this ballot exhaustion that happens. People don't fill out their choices and their ballot doesn't count. But what we've learned in looking back over ranked choice elections at the municipal level is that most times when people only vote for 1 or 2, they're voting for 1 or 2 who are most likely to win. So if you vote for the candidate who is most likely to win as your first choice, your ballot counts all the way through rounds of runoffs, right? So it's called bullet voting. It can be strategic. If you like the person who you think is very much likely to win or be in the top final 2, you don't have to rank the rest of your ballot, and your ballot is just as powerful and counts. And it doesn't inherently disadvantage the voter as long as they did vote for someone who remains in the race through those rounds of tabulation. Other questions? These are great questions.
I'm still stuck on the primary part. Earlier on, you talked about how the decisions are really made at the primary, where only about 10% of the people come out. So in what you've seen, does using this system mean, has it resulted in more people showing up at the primaries?
It's a great question. So we don't know yet, because this particular system hasn't been implemented anywhere yet in combination. What we can tell, or what we have learned from places that have implemented ranked choice ballots and or implemented a top 2 system. So in California and Washington State and in Nebraska for their state elections, they have an open top 2 primary where the top 2 candidates, regardless of party affiliation, advance forward. So various innovations similar to, but not the same as Final 5. Haven't seen statistically significant improvements in terms of voter turnout. We have heard anecdotally that populations turn out because all of a sudden they have choice of candidates that perhaps would not have been on the ballot. You might get, people to turn out for a particular candidate, and then all of a sudden they'll rank the rest of their choices because they got really excited about someone. Or theoretically, right, if your vote is going to matter more now, when your vote wouldn't have mattered previously, you might think you'd be inclined to go vote at a higher rate, because we know that one of the biggest causes that people, or at least that people self-report for the reason that they don't vote, why we have such poor voting rates, is because they don't feel like their vote matters. So if you take that away and their vote starts to matter, theoretically, you would see an increase in voter participation. But again, we don't have actual data to tell us yet on Final 5 how this system will affect that. But it's certainly something that we're looking at, and there are many studies being commissioned about Alaska's experiment, so we learn from it and know that we're getting data as it starts to come in. And I should say, so Alaska was the first, and I kind of alluded to the fact that it won't be the last, but there are 2 ballot initiatives coming up in this next cycle, in the 2022 electoral cycle, one in Nevada and one in Missouri for this particular combination of the top 5 and instant runoff general election. Other questions?
And those states, Nevada and Missouri, I think you said, are they do have binding ballot initiatives. Oh, okay.
Mhm. Yeah, Karen.
How long does it take to educate the public?
So
I
we
mean,
had,
This sounds like it's a mountain to climb, so.
I mean, I talk about it with the public all the time, and I will tell you that I'm constantly both surprised, I said this, right? Surprised and not surprised that when you tell people about this, they're totally on board because they are frustrated by their lack of choices. They feel like they're voting for the lesser of 2 evils. They love the idea of going in and ranking their choices. But if you talk to the people who are, kind of gets to Stella's question earlier, who are winning under the current system, who the current system is working for, change is just scary, because anytime something is working for us, change is scary, right? And no matter what you're talking about. So it's that constituency that most often uses the excuse of the fact that they don't think voters are going to be able to understand this. We brought in a county clerk from Utah who has implemented, I think, over 20 ranked choice elections now in Utah in his county for the hearing in the Wisconsin State Elections Senate Elections Committee in December. And he talked about how their concern was, how do we do voter education around this? So they went to what they thought were going to be kind of one of the most both important and potentially challenged constituency around this, which is to say they went to a assisted living kind of elder care facility to do an education presentation about it. And they talked not about how you filled out the ranked choice ballot. They just gave a quick overview of voting in general. And then they passed out the ballots and they let people fill them out. And the residents did just fine, right? They had no instructions on how to fill out the ballot. And based on just this idea of, fill in your bubbles, works perfectly well because we do it, all right? We do it all the time in our lives. We rank things. We just don't think about the fact that we're ranking them. But it's a very intuitive process for humans to go through, right? I ranked what I had for dinner tonight because I figured out what I wanted the most, but I didn't have that. So I had what I, my second choice. We do that all the time. But actually, so Senator Jeff Smith is one of our co-authors about this, and he just was interviewed about it, and he was asked that question of kind of how do you educate voters? Aren't we scared about voter confusion? And he said, well, you know what I'll tell you? This is one of those things that's way more complicated to explain than it is to do. Because to do is pretty simple. To explain, it kind of sounds complicated, and that freaks people out a little bit. But in everywhere that they've implemented, so what we do have data on is ranked choice voting, right? Because it has been implemented in so many municipalities, which are already lower information elections. You all know this more than anyone, right? The lowest turnout, the lowest information elections are these municipal, these nonpartisan elections. And they're the ones that have implemented this new ballot style of ranked choice. And the ballot rate, the ballot error rates are statistically not significantly different than error rates for a traditional ballot. And when you ask voters in exit polls what they thought, most recently in New York City, 95% of voters said they were not confused, that they understood completely what they needed to do. So, right, the proof is in that data that even in these low information elections, people do quite well. Yeah, Stella.
How many legislators in the Senate and in the House signed on to this bill for it to be introduced? How much support is there at this point?
22 co-authors or 22 co-sponsors.
Out of,
well, there are 132 in both, amongst both chambers. So we have 2 Senate co-authors, a Republican and a Democrat, and we have 2 Assembly co-authors, a Republican and a Democrat, and then an additional 18 members of the Assembly have signed on to the bill in support.
So only 2 senators. Okay, thanks.
Well, I'm optimistic by the questions and the dialogue that we had this evening. We're about at our hour mark, so let me just thank you all and tell you again, democracyfound.org. That's how you can stay in touch with us if you want to join our email list. I always tell people, I promise I don't spam. It is not a political email list. You will not get a request for a contribution every 5 minutes. It's actually a list that we just use when we actually have updates. So please don't hesitate to sign up if you're worried about that particular problem. And I look forward to staying in touch, because again, the real ask is to say, if you have places where you think this would be an interesting conversation, an interesting message that would be well received, please make the connections for us, because I will tell you, the hardest part is to convince people that they can have a conversation about Final Five voting and it won't be partisan. But if someone can vouch for it and say, yeah, I have heard Sarah, she really is not going to try to sell you a bill of goods and just try to sell you a partisan candidate message, then all of a sudden, as I think we've all experienced tonight, it's very well received conversation and an innovative new idea. Whether or not people ultimately agree, I think we can all agree that what is happening is not working. Our system is not serving us well, and there are some really perverse incentives happening in our current electoral system. So we need to be looking at alternatives, and in our democracy, it's incumbent on us to take that on. And you all, League of Women Voters, know that better than most anyone else. So I appreciate the opportunity to talk to people who have been working on these important issues of democracy for a long time. Yeah, Stella.
Would you please give that address again?
Oh, yes. And let me, you know what I will do? I will throw it in the chat as well, so that democracyfound.org. Democracy Found, not Democracy Fund. There is a Democracy Fund. They raise money. That's not us. I mean, we raise money too, but not in the same way.
That's FOUND.
Found, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sarah,
Thank
thank you
you
so
all.
much for joining us tonight. It was very enlightening, and people had a lot of good questions. So, and I thank everyone for coming to our Zoom meeting tonight. As Sandy put in the chat, that we will be posting this. Has been recorded. We will be posting it on our website and on our Facebook page, which is League of Women Voters Door County. So if you're talking to your friends and telling them about listening to this, and they'd like to hear more about that and hear it directly from Sarah, direct them to our website. It'll take a couple days to get it up, but we will have it up. So at this point, I will just thank you again for coming and wish everyone a good evening.
Thank you all.